Hello, welcome to the second session of this short course Exploring Drawing the Human Figure. Today we'll be looking at how we can use simple shapes like circles and squares, cubes, cylinders and spheres to help us draw a human figure. And we'll be looking at situations where it's particularly useful to be able to do that, such as foreshortening, which is what we've got here when we have the proportions changed by the angle of the body. Artists will often use this technique within preliminary drawings like these by Tamara De Lempicka. She also likes to continue that sort of blocky look that you get into her paintings. You might recognise these from the Art Deco of the 30s. In these examples by Matisse, we see really strong angles here, exploring how the figure could be composed within the picture space, and here exploring how elegant flowing lines can become part of the composition. And in a more finished work, we see that rather than slavishly trying to copy the anatomy of the figure, Matisse has allowed things to be distorted in order to encourage the flowing nature of these curves, the twists and the angles identified through those preliminary sketches. And something I would encourage you to recognise is that you don't have to go for a figure that is 100% photographic. What you're really after is catching enough so it feels real, but also that you can play with it and enjoy working with the figure. Here's a picture that I looked at during the last session, and what I'd like you to notice about the photograph is how the face is pointing one way and the body pointing in quite a different way. There's a very strong twist through the body. In fact, the hips, I think, are at a slightly different angle still. And if we go back to the structure drawing, that isn't really captured. But if we start to translate this into simpler forms, so we take the front of the face and see it as a sort of flat cube, possibly curved or square towards the back. And if we look at the body and treat it as more of a series of blocks, like so, we can begin to capture the different directions and the dynamic feeling of the body. Similarly, when it comes to the limbs, we can treat these as cylinders coming together. So cylinder here, another one there. And here. And it gives us a way of plotting out that figure, getting the way that the figure appears in space, and then we can refine it from there. So that's one use of this technique. It helps you see which direction the body is pointing in terms of different angles, and it's very useful for dancing figures. The other thing it's really useful for is foreshortening, which I'm going to look at now. So in this photocopy from How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, you can see foreshortening being addressed through a series of cylinders and cubes in the human body. And particularly if you look at this one, you really see how that helps establish one thing in front of the other, and that progression through space. And in these two examples of illustration, we see the artist having quite a lot of fun with foreshortening, exaggerating it, but there is enough realism in here for the piece of work to be very successful. So I'm going to start with this figure of somebody sitting down and their foot coming forward, and it's worth just looking with a ruler for a moment at how foreshortening really does distort the proportions, because if I look at the length of this foot, it's about 5 centimetres, and if I move that up, it's actually as wide as his shoulders. So you get quite a distortion. As things are closer, they look a lot bigger. As they're further away, they look smaller. And that's what we're going to be looking at how to tackle. And the first thing I'm going to do is look for a unit of measurement to compare things to. So we could use the head, but actually one of the most dominant things I just mentioned is this foot. And if that's 5 centimetres across that way, I take that measurement across again, at the same, that comes to roughly where the elbow is. You see that line there? And then another half a one takes me just past that foot. So that's 1, 2.5 feet in that direction. If I take that direction, that size upwards, 1, 2, I just lost that a little bit, 3 and a bit. And what we've got is the whole height is only 3 and a little bit feet. I'm going to draw a grid which is going to reflect that. Upwards. And I'm going to use that grid to help me draw. Okay, so a grid that size, I know if I plot it out on my piece of paper, that the figure will fit into it well, and I can establish that certain things are in line. So the end of the heel with the eye here, and where the hand is there. 2 feet across, and I'm vertically at the elbow. So I can sort of use that to help me measure. So I've just changed colour to help you be able to see what I'm drawing. I'd encourage you to use tracing paper for doing this stage so that you don't obscure your picture. But I'm doing it straight on it so that you can see it as clearly as possible. So I'm going to start with the face, and I've got this sort of front part of the face like that, and I can see a sort of ball curving around and coming forward. So that's my head shape. I can see the top of the shoulders, and then a very strong, slightly curved box shape for the torso. Circle here, and sort of tube there, and a sort of pointed cone, this point leading into that hand. Again, a rounded part on that shoulder, cylinder coming forward, a sort of pointed cone sort of shape there, and something for the hand. The hips are a little bit more hidden, but I can see that they're at a slightly different angle to the main body. I'm just going to block them in very loosely around there. I can see the knee, and it's very, very strong sort of cylinder coming forwards there. Again, the knee is hidden, imagine it's there. My thigh coming up, then this strong shape coming forwards. And look, because of the bell bottom being very clear, I'm using that in my drawing. And finally, the foot. The shoe is a kind of wedge shape. And here, slightly pointier wedge shape that goes backwards. Those elements help me draw my figure. So I have my grid on a piece of paper. Notice it's 1 foot, 2 foot and a half, 1, 2, 3 and a bit, up. Now you might say a bit, see, that's not very precise. Well, it isn't all about precision, it's about observation. So this is good enough. It gives me lots of points of reference that I can work from. But I mustn't rely too much just on that. I must keep looking at the picture, which is why it's useful to have the tracing separate, because my lines at the moment cover this over quite a lot. So I will, when I get to do more detail, need to look at a picture without all this drawing over the top. Now, I'm working quite small so that the camera can capture this easier, but I encourage you to scale up because this is a very useful way of scaling up. So anyway, I'm going to start working with coloured pencil, and normally I'd start with a lighter colour, but I want to make sure you can see this clearly. So I'm going to use red, and I can see that the head starts here, coming down with that front very distinct and definite sort of front about there. Got my shoulders, block of the shoulders, and the body coming downwards. It's quite a steep angle about there, around that shoulder, and then that angle coming up. Where does it come up to? I think my shoulder should have come across a bit further. Just make that adjustment, and that's better. That fits in more. So you can see how the grid helps me refer back to where things should be. That sort of under the hand there, underneath the chin, the other shoulder coming out with the elbow about there, coming across, join that other hand about there. Check that sort of hip there, and we have got the knee here, this leg coming forwards. It should be coming towards a slightly different angle. That's better. That wedge of the foot going right into the corner there. Notice how as I'm going along I make little corrections. It isn't all about being accurate and, and get it spot on straight away. That should be down a little bit further, bum. But you can sort of make corrections because you've got this framework on which you can see how things should be. A little bit higher. And you need to remember that you might think you know what the size of things are, but foreshortening distorts and changes that. So you have to trust what the grid and the measurements say rather than thinking, no, that doesn't look right. So there's my basic outline of my figure, and the next stage is then to start to work into it. So when it comes to working back into it, this is about you now with your framework having some fun, and it's important to not get bogged down in trying to make it too 100% realistic. However, I've rubbed away my grid now, and I've got a copy of the picture again so I can keep looking at that because it will give me little hints and ideas. And I'm just going to have a play with some watercolour pencils and just see how it all gets on. I could play with that more if I wanted to, but I think you get the idea. There is one thing I just want to talk about a little bit on this though, and that is how I've used lines overlapping each other to suggest that something is in front of something else. and to give it a little bit more of a 3D effect. So having this line overlap the back of there helps project this part of the leg forward. Similarly, this line of the front of the leg pushes it in front of the thigh. The arm here, with a line here, it helps put it in front of the upper arm there, and so on. And this is an important principle which I just want to dwell on for a moment in terms of drawing. So here we have a picture of an arm reaching forwards, but only the outline is shown. Now there's always problems with just drawing the outline. One is getting it accurate in the right place, but the other problem is that actually it doesn't really look like it's coming forwards. However, if we treat this as a series of shapes which overlap each other, so we have the hand here, which is overlapping a cylinder of the forearm to here, and then another cylinder going down to the shoulder here, and then the shoulder there. If we treat it in that way, it can make it look a lot more three-dimensional. So look at the difference here. The hand clearly sits in front of the forearm. The forearm sits in front of the upper arm, and the upper arm sits in front of the shoulder. So that idea of showing something as a series of shapes or forms, one in front of the other, to help project forward. And that is a device which can really help you. And I'm going to show an example of that. So I'm going to show the stages of the example looking at somebody doing a martial art. So I have this very dynamic pose. I've created a grid, and the grid size is, again, I've used a foot because it's so dominant. I'm going to do something slightly different in this one though, is I just want to, before I do anything else, actually draw on some directional lines, a little bit like we did in the first session. So there to the hips, and there to the knee, and out to the end of the foot. From here, the hip point down and then back up again. The shoulders, the arms. And don't forget that use of line, because that really helps me with the direction of this body, and it will help me on plotting this out again and drawing it. Again though, we've got the front of the face there, the side of the head, a curve. We've got a torso which is hard to see, but nevertheless curves quite dramatically around that centre line, which we can see, and the hips really sort of enlarged here. We have the shoulder and a cylinder, and another one coming forwards to this fist. We can't see the whole of that arm, but we can see that part. Then we can see this thigh coming forwards, and another one coming, the foreleg there, and the foot here. And we can break it down into those simpler shapes and forms, but this time using both directional lines and, where it's useful, using the cubes and cylinders. With any dynamic picture, it's worth doing 2 or 3 studies, and here just using loose scribbly lines to try to get the feel of the pose. Here again, a first sort of attempt gridding it up and trying to work out how the body works and breaks down into different pieces. Because it's such a dynamic pose, it did take a few exercises to help me get my mind into how to draw it, trying out using more of a scribbly stick figure, trying out using volumes, and so on, and also studying little details. It was quite a trick to try to work out what to do with the lines on the feet, for example. But once I'd got my basics, I still want to have as much fun as possible with it, so I played around with brushes and inks and so on here, and a little bit of Tipp-Ex to add a bit of extra highlight and detail into it. I'd encourage you to start off with something fairly simple like a seated pose, but then perhaps try something a little bit more dynamic, like a dancing figure or martial arts or something like that. But remember that the bottom line is you should be having fun with it. So have a go, but don't feel afraid to then play around a lot more with the materials once you've got the basics down. That's all for this session. The final session we'll be looking at playing around with your figures a lot more, perhaps exploring more abstraction and so on. So for example, playing around with silhouettes like this, playing around with repeating a figure and perhaps treating it more angularly, looking at ideas of using pattern within your work, looking at working with overlapping and more decorative techniques. So look forward to seeing what you do between now and then. If you do Facebook, please do join the Artful Facebook page and post what you've been doing, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye bye.